And then we are going to go to agenda item 7, which is going to be incorporation planning. And I do believe we have Karen Dempsey is going to kick us off with our weekly reminder.
Yes, sir. As you noted, this is my regular reminder that on August 13th, the Township Board of Directors did call an incorporation election to be included on the November 2nd ballot. 2 propositions will appear, and the wording for those propositions was developed by legal counsel and is based on requirements in state law, including the township's enabling legislation. The first proposition is Proposition A, which creates the City of the Woodlands and sets its maximum initial tax rate. Residents can vote for or against this proposition, and the wording is to authorize the Type A City incorporation of the Woodlands Township District in the adoption of an initial tax rate of not more than 22.31 cents per $100 valuation of taxable property. Proposition B depends on Proposition A passing, and it transfers the township's rights, responsibilities, and authorities from the township to the new City of the Woodlands, dissolving the township, and residents may vote for or against this. That proposition reads, upon incorporation of the Woodlands Township District into a Type A general law city to be called the City of the Woodlands, the transfer of the rights, powers, privileges, duties, purposes, functions, responsibilities, the authority to issue bonds, and the authority to impose taxes from the Woodlands Township District to the City of the Woodlands. Some of the key dates which are coming up are October 4th, which is the deadline to register to vote. If you are unsure about the status of your voter registration, you can check www.montgomeryvotes.org or www.harrisvotes.org to find that information. The first day of early voting is October 18th. The last day of early voting is October 29th. And the last day to apply for a ballot by mail is October 22nd. That can also be handled through your county elections office. November 2nd is, of course, Election Day. In order to be eligible to vote in this election, you must be a registered voter in the county of your residence, and your residence must be within the boundaries of the Woodlands Township. Here again are the websites where you can check your voter registration. You can also find out what precinct you're in, and you can also request the ballot by mail through information on those links. For more information on the election in general, including not just the incorporation propositions, but also the director's election that is being held on the same ballot, you can visit the township website at www.thewoodlandstownship-tx.gov/November election. To learn more about the incorporation study, you can visit the incorporation study website at www.thewoodlandsincorporationstudy.com. Last week, the board did hold its informational session on Thursday, September 23rd. Following that, we did receive the final transmittal letter and report from the Novak Consulting Group, which is now posted online on the study website, which simply explains the process that happened from the conclusion of their work on the study to the financial information that was presented on August 13th. That concludes my presentation.
And I think we're still working on the, I think we had about 115 Q&As from last week's public forum.
We did. We received over 104 individual cards, some of which listed multiple or multi-part questions. The first batch of those Q&A should go up, I believe, tomorrow. And then we will add the responses in batches from there.
And we're going to have that as a identified forum Q&A, so they know it's the newest.
Yes,
okay.
Sir.
And the videos from the breakouts?
Those are also available online now.
They're online now?
Yes,
All
sir.
right. Look, I came here to learn. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
And Nick.
Will we post, I've had people reach out regarding location of where we can vote and the times. Sometimes we voted on Sunday afternoon in addition, and I did not see it on the website earlier, but I assured people that that would be something that we would post also?
Yes. So right now, that is available in the election order that is posted
Yes.
online. Some of that polling information is still subject to change, but on Monday, we will be posting full voter information in terms of hours for early voting, and then the locations as well. In Harris County, because they use countywide polling sites, we typically will just list the two that are closest in proximity. And of course, the election websites are always the easiest way to ensure that if any changes, that everything's caught up to current.
Yeah, I was
And
gonna-
there's one other, at the informational session, at their report, there is one error where they said that there was a unanimous vote by the board. On September 25th, 2019, the assumption to include 1.25 million per year for concrete and asphalt maintenance and repairs was presented to the board. A vote was taken and it was not unanimous. And so the slide deck needs to reflect that.
The Novak Consulting Group sent us a amended presentation today that does footnote that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Karen, I would suggest that anything we put up about polling places has a link to the appropriate election, boards.
Yes, sir.
Shouldn't rely on information that we put up. People should be checking, the websites of the people who are in charge of the elections. So,
Yes, and we consistently do that.
thanks.
All right, thank you, Karen. And now we'll have Monique.
Okay, it's at the board's pleasure, but I have two presentations I can make tonight. One of them is on the law enforcement information regarding incorporation, so I'll be glad to do that. The other one is on the reports of, how will I put it? It's from the outside developer report where it talks about reserves being built up and some of the misinformation, that's my word, that's regarding all of that. So I can do one, both?
Might as well do both.
Okay. I will start with the law enforcement. Okay, thank you. As you may be aware, there is information that we have presented several times regarding the law enforcement cost in our financial model, and then there has been some information put out by other people that are that disagree with that financial information. So what I want to do tonight is, again, you've seen some of this, but I've shortened the presentation that was given previously to just focus on those particular areas. What I want to start off with is what I have said before and why this is important to me personally, and I believe to the Board of Directors for the township as an organization. The information that we provide in our financials and in our budgeting is looked at by outside entities and closely monitored. So as I've said before, this is about more than just incorporation information. This is about the integrity of our financial data and the confidence that others, including our residents, but beyond our residents, that people rely on. So for instance, I'm talking about credit rating agencies, our bondholders, Bond Disclosure Council, banking and other financial institutions, our auditors. We have routine conversations with GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association. So again, I just want to put that out there, that this is a large reason why I continue to address this. The township works very diligently to maintain productive working relationships with each of these, and some of the things that I listed down below, some of those are what we routinely use and represent to others that we use in terms of preparing our financials and our budgeting forecasting. So you can see there the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, the Financial Accounting Standards Boards, GFOA Best Practices and Resources, and Standard & Poor's and Moody's, again, routinely share information and required to share information in some cases with these entities that rely on us providing reliable and transparent information. Just the most recent example we have of that is the Standard & Poor's Global Ratings, where they upgraded the township's credit rating from a AA to a AA+. That rating, let me go to the next page. Some of the things that were that had long conversations with the credit agencies. Again, this is an annual thing. So I wanted to point out that the credit agencies are aware that incorporation is under consideration, and that's what that first paragraph right there says. So I don't want anyone to think that we haven't been communicating with the credit agencies. They know this is. They've looked at our information. They see what our financial projections are. We've talked to them about how the increased costs that come with incorporation, what the revenues that are going to be used to offset that, the tax rate. So they're very aware of everything that's going on. I've seen comments to the contrary, so I wanted to point that out. And with that, even knowing with the incorporation, they did feel very comfortable in awarding us that upgrade to the AA+. So they're aware of it. They know what's going on. And we got the upgrade in our credit rating anyway. One of the things that they talk about a lot in our report, and I've just done a couple of, I've snipped out a couple of things here. One of them is they talk all the time about our stable finances with very strong reserves. So when I talk about having strong reserves is important to maintain that credit rating, over and over and over, that is what they talk about. They talk about our conservative budget assumptions, our prudent debt use, and consistently growing major revenue sources. They also looked at our information regarding the pandemic, and contrary, again, to I know some comments that have been made, we did, and they noticed that we did have a decrease in revenue. So I know sometimes it's said that we really weren't impacted by that, but that's not true, and that's evident in all of our financials that we did have a loss in revenue related to the pandemic. So moving on, I just wanted to use that as a preface to everything that we're talking about why that's important that people have confidence in our financial information that we provide. So first I want to look at the commissioned report that was prepared by the REF Consulting Services. This was one of the groups, one of the consultants that was commissioned by the Howard Hughes Corporation and issued a report. Specifically, I'm going to focus on the law enforcement pieces, which are the ones circled there, where basically in total $7.7 million. They claim were an understatement of expenses related to our law enforcement model. The reason that they said this, again, starting at the top, is that there was an expectation that the new city will have a full-service police force. And so the evidence that the consultant used in terms of an expectation was a statement written by staff in the Community magazine in August, a statement made by a board member a couple of years ago, and they said that hybrid model was only an option. And so the consultant's conclusion, and these are not my words, these are his words that are listed here, is this leaves no doubt that the full service model should be used in the financial models for incorporation, and because of this inconsistency, there's a significant understatement. So the incorporation, I guess what I would say to that is the best source to determine the intent of the Township Board of Directors regarding the cost to include in the incorporation model is not a random statement made in a board meeting or in a magazine that may or may not have been taken out of context. And so it is clear in the January 15, 2020 board meetings that the board did approve the hybrid model. And here it is right here. This is a screenshot from the minutes. It shows that actually Director Reeser moved to approve inclusion of the hybrid operating model and then the full service debt load. So what that means, if you'll recall what the board decided, is the operating model was the hybrid, but in terms of the cost of the police station and the municipal court, the board went with the higher level so that it would give a citizens committee in the future if they wanted to transition to that cost would be available in terms of the capital. So that is what that means. And then also, just want to point out that the other consultants commissioned by Howard Hughes Corporation agree with us that the board of directors did approve the hybrid approach for law enforcement, and this is what they list in their report. So again, just want to make that clear because this came out yesterday from Preserve the Woodlands saying that the township falsely claims that the consultants claim that law enforcement operations and capital were underfunded by $7.7 million, which is what we just talked about, was based on analyzing a different law enforcement model than the one approved by the Township Board of Directors. They're saying that when we say that is a false statement. Obviously, we just saw that is not a false statement. It is in the minutes. And then they go on to say that the total costs being ignored by the board amount to $7.65 million in year 5 when the full service model is scheduled to take effect, which again is not anything this board has ever discussed, and then go on to say that would require a 15.6 property tax. So that is not any information that is based in fact or in any motion or approval by this board of directors. So want to point that out. Now I'm going to move on to this report. Again, this was this analysis. As you can see, I took this directly from their report where they say that their analysis was commissioned by the Howard Hughes Corporation. And this was their critique of the Novak Consulting Group's law enforcement report, and their report was dated September 6, 2021. So I want to show here what the consultants, the information that they relied on for their analysis. So down at the bottom, highlighted in yellow, you can see that in terms of the reports and the videos that they looked at from the board of directors, stopped at May 15th of 2020. So on the next page, they do say that they looked at the 2021 contract budget with the township for law enforcement and the 2021 agreement with Harris County, and we're going to get to that in just a second, why that's important. They mentioned on June 10th of 2021, so that was before the board had even made a decision on whether or not to call the election, that they were interviewing Montgomery County officials. And then they do state that they based their decision based on the documents, videos, and interviews cited above. So here's a list of the meetings and the documents that they did not review prior to issuing their report on September 6, 2021. So all of this information was publicly available prior to the release of their date, and all of these meetings and documentation pertained in some way to the incorporation initiatives or the base budget where all of these law enforcement costs were included. So I'm not going to read through all of those, but obviously multiple meetings, multiple documentation out there supporting the updates to the law enforcement model that we made from the report that was originally issued in 2020. So I'm going to go through just very quickly some of the things here. These are, again, screenshots of the consultant's report, the law enforcement consultant report. The first paragraph, they state, and so this, again, is what the public is reading, that the Novak report is a compilation and summary of the current status of law enforcement and associated costs. That, of course, is false. These are costs. The costs that were in that report were costs as of October 1st, October 1st, 2019. They also state that it does not, our model does not, but should include reimbursement cost of $718,000 for patrol vehicles. That is a false statement. We do have annual funding provided for those vehicles. In the paragraph 2, they claim that we did not take into account any increase for salaries and benefits, and that we did not, in our 5-year plan, use any type of CPI index to grow expenses. Again, that is a false statement, and we're going to look at that in a second. That is, of course, elementary forecasting and budgeting, and of course, we provide that in our model. So in order to get to one of their shortfalls that they claim that is in the consultant report of $7.2 million, what they did is they compared cost, non-inflated cost, as of October 1st, 2019 to inflated cost as of October 1st, 2021. That was their cost. So of course, it's no surprise that when you do something like that, that you would come up with a shortfall. The important point here is that is not at all what was done. So, as I mentioned earlier, they did have access to the 2021 contract with Montgomery County, and as a matter of fact, it's attached as an exhibit to their report. So they reviewed it, and in that, they could clearly see that the salary and compensation cost in that contract, which the township was obligated to provide for salaries, was $9.4 million. The sentence in green just shows that it even says that we're certifying that all payments under that agreement were being made from the current year budget funds. In terms of B, there again is in the contract, where you remember earlier, they said that we did not use that exact number, $718,432 for vehicles. It's actually in the contract they reviewed. So clearly, we did have that funding available. And then we also, there's not a dispute on the fuel, but those were the three costs in there. So if you add all of those three up, it's $10.4 million that we were obligated in the 2021 contract to provide. They also looked at the Harris County contract and saw available in there the funding of $1.3 million. So when you look here, you can see from Montgomery County, what we showed a minute ago, and my slide numbers are wrong, I'm sorry, I didn't update those. For the Montgomery County contract, there was a cost of $10.4 million, the Harris County, $1.3 million, Safe Harbor and Internet, I didn't show that because it's a smaller amount of $420. So in total, by the 2021 contracts, there was $12.1 million of funding available. So in spite of the consultants having reviewed those numbers and knew that that funding was in our budget, they continued to use the $11.2 million in their report that was issued to the public in September of 2021. And so I'm just showing here again that circle, the big circle in red down in their chart is what they continued to use, the $11.2 million, and they carried that out through year 4 in spite of the fact of what we just saw. So that was 2021. Now let's look at 2022. Again, this is information that was all available in multiple resources, documents, presentations, videos, online for them to access prior to the release of their report. So you'll recall that they, again, said that we do not include vehicles in our budget, and there at the top is that 718 by the time we got out to 2022 was actually 1.2 million. So that's what we're carrying forward in vehicles. They claim that we did not use the 5% salary increase that Montgomery County budgeted. There it is, circled in blue. We used higher than 5%. We used 9.2%. because it was 5% for salaries, but they had increases in health insurance and their retirement plan, their pension. So that was there. So in total, the law enforcement services budget for 2022 was $13.7 million. So that's quite a difference from the $11.1 million that they reported that we had available. You'll recall they said that we did not use a CPI index in our budgeting. Here is a page from our budget model. We have constant dollars, which is the number that we just looked at, the 13.7 million. But then, of course, we have a CPI index to grow our expenses out in the 5-year plan, and that is what you see down there in the blue box listed below. So out in 2025, you can see, which is the year 4 that we've been focusing on, we had the $14.4 million available for funding for the current law enforcement. So let me stress that this is just for the 92 current patrol deputies and the Harris County deputies. So again, this is just showing what it grows to. So this is where we end up. The report in the consultants, the chart that the consultants used, maintaining that $11.2 million from 2019, not inflating it. They said our 4-year total was $44.6 million. Down below in the chart below is the amount that's actually in our budget, which is $56 million. So the consultants that were commissioned by the Howard Hughes Corporation understated our funding by $11.4 million. In spite of that, obvious, and what has actually been presented before, the Preserve the Woodlands did say in their report that they released yesterday that we falsely claim that the consultants understated funding for already current township law enforcement personnel by $11.4 million. So clearly, we are not falsely claiming that. That is shown right there and is all available in any public document that anyone would want to look at.
Yeah, there's actually someone who's falsely claiming. It's the people that put this crap out there on the internet. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but could you go back to the very first slide that shows the two people who did this report?
Sure.
One more forward, where it says the two names. One more.
Oh, did I miss it? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. There
So
we go.
here's what confuses me. One of these individuals has a PhD, and they're presenting research. I teach at an R2 research institution, and I also do what is called IRB-approved research. No person would publish research like this that was completely a misrepresentation of facts, and I guarantee you, no research review board would ever approve research like this. This is actually an insult to people who have PhDs and doctorates, and I'd like to make sure the public knows that. This person has no business publishing information that is completely erroneous, a complete misrepresentation of facts, and not even using the information in the reports that they say they used. I don't know this person, but I don't know what their PhD is in, but it's not in research, I can tell you that much.
The second piece that they are claiming that we did not account for were for the new direct personnel that would come on, the 19 positions. So this is outside of what we're currently funding. Showed this before, and I'm not going to go as into great of detail on this one because it's the same principles that we just talked about. So information's available, it was not reviewed, so the costs are understated. And in addition to that, the reason that I corrected their number, which I normally wouldn't, is they misinterpreted the transition agreement and started picking up cost a year earlier than what's provided for in the contract. So that's why I changed their number instead of the 9.7 to 7.3. What we have included in our budget is the $7.4 million, so we actually are $65,000 more than what they say. So again, there is no funding shortfall related to these positions in our budget. It is fully accounted for in our budget. So when we look at this all together, this is where they come up with their $12 million shortfall based on and looking out at 4 years. So the top part is what we looked at previously, the $7.2 million, where they said that shortfall that they claim, where they said that we had what we should have is $51.8 million. We actually do have $56 million that we showed in previous slides. So we actually have $4.2 million more in funding than what the law enforcement consultants are saying that we should have. The second part is the 19 new positions, which I just talked about. So again, once you put the corrected numbers in there and the amounts that are in our budget, again, publicly available, we have a funding surplus there. So they came up with a $12 million shortfall, and in reality, we have a $4.3 million surplus from what they actually state that we should have. Third, we've talked about this one before, so I'm not going to, again, go over it in great detail. They claim that we did not account for $6.1 million of the new vehicles. So in the original NOVAC report, at that point in time, there was an understanding or at least ongoing consideration that the Montgomery County would allow us to have ownership of all the vehicles that we have funded over the years. But in the second transition agreement, it was clear that that was not going to happen. So obviously we had to update the model to account for those additional expenses, which we did here. So we do have them in different sources. There's some in the operating budget, which we looked at a little while ago, that $1.2 million that I mentioned. That's the ongoing. We have money in the Incorporation Reserve and money in the Capital Reserve. So in total, we have funding for $9.8 million in vehicles. But again, Preserve the Woodlands said that we falsely claimed that the consultants understated available township funding for law enforcement vehicles by $6.1 million. So they're saying that that was a false claim by us, which clearly it is not. So this is the last slide. So what again, I guess the gist of all of this is the law enforcement critique that was commissioned by the Howard Hughes Corporation is based on outdated projections. There was updated public information available prior to release of the report, but it was not used in their analysis. And that information, just there in summary, was included in all of those different documents. And so the total amount by which the Law Enforcement Commission report understates funding available in the Woodlands Township Incorporation model is $22 to $24 million.
And Monique, on this slide, it might be beneficial to re-emphasize that we had no funding shortfalls, because a layperson reading this may only look at the bottom number
Okay.
and get confused. I think we should 100% always reinforce the fact that their number's wrong.
Okay, that's a good point. Thank you. I will update it for that.
And then
And
once you've done that, would you send this out, please?
Yes, sir, I will. Be glad to.
I mean, I don't know what to say. We had a debate on Tuesday, shared facts, shared the prior analysis with these folks who, I guess, a day later, basically want to continue to push out false information.
I know what to say. They don't care about the truth. The only way that they can fulfill their false narrative and agenda is to continue to put out information they know is misleading, inaccurate. Their propaganda method is unlike anything that's been seen for decades, okay? They are completely presenting a false narrative to this community. And I'll say one thing. I'm glad that some of the people engaged in this actually work for a company who has people working elsewhere within their company that truly understands financial modeling, or else they would never be able to get to the point of having a 9.3% return on their investments. Because no one locally here who does this stuff would be able to run a business and achieve that. This is an insult not only to our residents and to the people that work in the township, this is an insult to the company they represent. If I worked for this company, I would be insulted by it.
That's right.
It's ridiculous.
And it's a knowingly, willfully, grossly misinformed information. I mean, they know it, and they continue to push this stuff out every day. Papers, emails. It's really, and publicly, those people I know who are listed on the board of this Preserve the Woodlands and for the Howard Hughes should step aside and tell them and say, you know what, I'm not going to be part of this, because really it's a shame on their name as well.
Shame.
I wouldn't want my name to be part of any of this really false, grossly false information. It's really unacceptable. I mean, I might be showing my age here, but I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the National Enquirer. Remember them? Remember that paper? Used to go and used to have, like, aliens used to come down, save people. Well, that is what these newspapers and this information has come down to. I mean, it is a joke. And the only thing good that paper, Preserve the Woodlands, is good for is for your kitty litter box. And that's about it.
The other thing that's insulting is that 2 elected officials in this county met with the people that put this crap together, knew they were looking at information that wasn't even in the agreement they negotiated and signed with the township, and still didn't correct them and let them print this false crap. Shame on them.
They negotiated in bad faith. They actually misrepresent their own contract
They do.
that they actually contracted.
I mean, it's disgusting, quite honestly.
I don't normally ask questions of the presenter, but in this case, having read some information online, Monique, can you tell me whether or not the reports that you were indicating that you've been discussing in your presentation, whether or not they were relying on collective bargaining and civil service, because both of those things must be approved under Texas state law by voters.
I actually don't know. I've just been concentrating on what I know is inaccurate in terms of comparison to what's actually in our financial model.
Yeah, so I did read the report.
Okay.
There's assertions that those things would be an issue, but there was no dollar amounts associated with it. And to your point, those aren't real issues unless voters approve allowing collective bargaining.
Exactly, that's correct. I had seen some misinformation online,
Right.
but I hadn't delved into the specifics of these reports, and so that's why, hence my question.
And it is disappointing because, Monique, almost 2 weeks ago, went line item by line item through this. The local media is absent. The Villager, Conroe Courier, Houston Chronicle, crickets. And, we have a population of 120,000 people that, when we called them out for the misinformation, instead of acknowledging, okay, we made a mistake, they doubled down on, we're right, you're wrong, and we're audited. No one's auditing these PACs. They can put anything they want into print. And look, you can be for or against incorporation, but we should all be for the truth. And again, appreciate you having to go through this one more time. It appears that the commitment to misinformation is strong, because they're not just putting this out there, they're funding, boosting it. They are paying for it to be promoted to the population, which is different than just going out and making a misstatement or putting out misinformation. They're putting money behind it. And to the elected officials that cut the videos based on these reports. Have any of them retracted the use of their images or their videos? No. No. So.
25 years ago, I worked for a CEO of a company who told me the most important thing you can do when you're going to represent information you didn't create is to inspect and verify before you open your mouth.
That's right.
That's very important.
Well, I find it very interesting that, and thanks for pointing out, they had these conversations in June. We hadn't even gotten to the point of putting this on a ballot.
Right.
If Rand Henderson was authentically concerned about the inadequacies of our law enforcement transition agreement that he negotiated and that Commissioner Nowak approved, why in the hell didn't they come tell us something before August 13th? You can't be authentically concerned that you're going to dismantle law enforcement and have a public safety concern by staying silent and waiting until, what was it, September 15th to release the report?
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Really? There's no authenticity in their concerns. We have a contract. Whether they like it or not, it says what it says. There's no change in law enforcement the day after if this passes, or if it fails.
Right.
We are contracted, and they can't undo the contract that they already voted for and approved less than 12 months ago. So 100% same faces, same people, the day after, either way. And it is disappointing. And Bob, I hope that somebody can implore these elected officials to stand up and say, look, I was wrong. I didn't know the information I was sharing was inaccurate. And after being corrected now multiple times, retract and rescind their assertions, because it's based on these reports.
I would hope that they would also.
But don't you think, I think we stated this last time, that they still haven't come to our staff and asked these questions. Now, when you're doing research, don't you think you should go to the most accurate information to get? You would want to go to the most accurate.
It's a requirement, John. In order
Right.
for a research proposal to be approved,
Right.
that's one of the requirements.
Right.
Okay?
It's not coming up with just deciding what points of data you wish to retract from a report and just
There's
utilizing it.
rules regarding it, there's ethics regarding it when you conduct research that you publish.
Right.
Especially when you're recognized as having a particular terminal degree that is based on research, you take an oath to apply, to agree to the code of ethics to research and the way you publish material.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, well, we will do what we can to help correct the errant information that is circulating rampantly throughout the community by reiterating the facts. The facts are what the facts are, and we want our residents to weigh in and make their decision based on factual information. So, Monique, we will do all we can. Bruce?
Yeah, I just have one more question, Robin, since you mentioned collective bargaining would have to be approved by the residents of the Woodlands. So would civil service, would it not?
That's correct. So, civil
And-
service,
and
civil
it-
service under Chapter 143 specifically requires that the voters approve civil service. Jeff has worked for civil service cities, I think. And Chapter 174 also requires an election. I believe meet and confer also requires voter approval.
I would
I've
suggest
not had a
one.
meet and confer city,
I would suggest one slide
unless they have civil service.
that might be helpful with the law enforcement piece.
Yes, sir.
The slide from Novak's presentation last Thursday, slide 51,
Okay.
is an excellent representation of our actual 5-year law enforcement plan.
Yeah, okay.
That shows the entirety, that there is not a single reduction in law enforcement services under our plan, and shows the growth of our law enforcement personnel and support staff over that 5-year period.
Thank you. I will do
I
that.
think it's an excellent slide. When I show it to people, they're like, oh, so you're really not cutting law enforcement? No,
I have
we're
one other
not.
thing I'd like to add too, because
Yes,
there's
sir.
a viral campaign out there trying to justify that we would have the inability to hire a quality police force. So how I would answer that is, A, we have one of the highest qualified and ranked fire departments in the country, right? And we do that as a township. And the other misinformation that's out there is that you don't want to be the police chief in a city like the Woodlands because the board is chaotic and they can't agree on anything. So what I would say to that is, anybody who believes that, I'm sure Chief Buck would be happy to tell you about all of the times the chaotic board has instigated issues with our fire department and got involved in his day-to-day operations and disrupted his department. I'm sure he'd be happy to sit down and discuss that with anybody. So what I'm trying to say is what's reflective of what this township, not this board, because it's been here forever, but the township has built in a world-class fire department would be the exact same approach this township would take to building a world-class law enforcement and police department. And I have no doubt in my mind, the quality of the individuals that a city of the Woodlands would attract to work here would be equal to or exceed the quality of any law enforcement department in the state of Texas.
I agree, 100%, Bob. 100%.
Absolutely.
And it's an insult to the people that work for this township to say that it'd be otherwise. It's an insult to Chief Buck to say that it's any different.
Well, it's also an insult to law enforcement personnel.
It is.
To preclude that they wouldn't want to be employed by the lowest crime rate area of our county that offers 52% of their patrol time for community policing, which means that they'd be dealing with less violent crime and less altercations underneath our community policing model at a level of service that doesn't get provided probably anywhere else.
Right.
And there's plenty of places around the country that don't like law enforcement, and those law enforcement professionals chose that career for their life. This is a very law enforcement friendly community that would be welcoming to them. And I think there'd be a lot of people happy to work here. Just like when we have an opening in the fire department, we get hundreds of applications.
Yeah.
And, when we get to the point, if something passes, I agree with you, Bob. Everything we've ever done has always been top-notch. Parks, fire department, covenant administrations, park and rides, trolleys, visit the woodlands, waste management even, come on, we even do trash right. So I think we can get this, we have the right talent pool in our community to move on, but appreciate you, Monique.
Thank you. Okay. Here's the next presentation, and I'm just, from now on, I'm just going to put this at the front of every presentation, again, just to remind everybody that this is important, that people be able to rely on our, have confidence in our information and the transparency. That has been the way before the township, even in the community association days, thanks to the policies and the dedication of the board of directors and staff related to that.
Monique, let me just put a little clarity behind this. Essentially, what you're talking about here, and the presentation you're seeing, is essentially the township's K-1. No corporation in America and no municipality in America would misrepresent their financial data because they'd get called out immediately by all of these agencies to say, folks, that's not true.
Right.
And and the fact that Monique and and your staff have done have gotten nothing but awards for excellence every single budget since the township was formed in 2010, exemplary financial budgeting and all of the audit reports. I don't even remember an audit report with a significant item on it in the 6 years I've been on this board. I just find it, personally, I find it, incredible that the Howard Hughes Corporation would call into question these numbers. Apparently, Moody's and GASB and FASB and all these other organizations obviously don't know a damn thing about what's going on. It's pretty shocking, frankly. And, all I can say to the residents is, I think you should believe what you see and not what you're told. And, look for yourself, get the facts. If you want to be against an incorporation, that's fine. But don't do it because you're being lied to. Please don't do it because you're being lied to.
Thank you. Again, that's why I brought this up. This is hugely important to me that these entities and our residents be able to rely on the information that we provide. Okay, so the source for the majority of this presentation is a report. It's titled An Outside Developer's Analysis of Incorporation. And again, in order to, just as we were talking about, to make sure to present the factual information and reliable information is why I'm going through this. So this is a page out of the report. These first pages are just sort of random. But this, again, is sort of the same issue as what we were just talking about with law enforcement. These are old numbers from the original report. As we just talked about, there's much more current information out there publicly, but that is not what was included in this analysis. Wanted also to talk about this. This is included in the same report, talking about the property tax freeze. So the slide on the left looks familiar. That's a slide that I have presented multiple times. But this slide is also now in the analysis, and it talks about tax hikes instead of meaningful tax cuts. And it says the real problem here is higher tax rates, so it's going to wipe out any savings and then some that's being offered by this tax freeze. Well, that's just not an understanding of how a tax freeze works. So the property tax ceiling freezes the amount of taxes paid in the year of qualification. So higher tax rates or increases in taxable value have no effect on the frozen tax amount. So whatever you pay in the year of qualification, the rate can go up a penny, the rate can go up, whatever it goes up, or your value of your home, and that is not going to impact the amount of tax that you paid in the first year. With the one qualification I always want to make, unless you make a significant improvement to your home, but stay in status quo, it won't. Lower tax rates, however, or decreases in taxable value will decrease the amount of the tax levy. So if you experience that, your tax rate, the amount of tax will actually go down. And then finally, there's a lot of misinformation about that. The tax freeze cannot be rescinded once enacted. So just wanted to clear that up.
Well, while we're on that, I think Todd's going to update a presentation for us possibly next week. Commissioner Nowak's out there saying that in 10 years, 35% to 40% of our taxpayers are going to have this tax freeze, and it's going to create some massive inequity to the younger population. So just did a cursory demographic 10-year look back, and we're not going to present it tonight because Todd needs to get a little more data points. But the average age of a Woodlands resident from 2010 was 38 and a half, and in 2020 it's 40.8, something like that. Yeah. So we're not going to have 30 to 40% of our homeowners qualified for a freeze in the next decade.
You mean we're not going to turn into a geriatric retirement community all of a sudden?
Well, I mean, look, he's saying it, and every time he says it, I'm like, no, I don't see how we age that fast, because you can't go from an average age of 40 to an average age over 65 in a decade. It's just math. Now, we may have more people that age into the tax credit, but we also have a lot of those folks who relocate to go live wherever their grandkids are, wherever their kids are.
It's cyclical,
But Gordy,
yes.
we've already proven they're not very good at math.
I understand. I think it's important for people to understand that this is a benefit to the senior and the disabled. It's not a detriment to everybody else.
Yes, sir. This is something else that is in this report. It says, per the referenced Incorporation study, which is the original study which he's referring to here, the consultant recommended an increase in the maximum tax rate to 28.62 cents. The Township Board approved this recommendation in February 2020, which then allows the township to raise the tax rate to 28.62 cents without your vote. So that is obviously false. That was what the board did in February of 2020. That was the provisional. Actually, the board made emphasized that it was a provisional rate based on the information available at that time. Obviously, again, referring back to 3-year-old data instead of using the current updated model, which again is available. So just to make clear, and Karen Dempsey provided this a little while ago, the Township Board of Directors approved a tax rate of 22.31 cents. For the rate that's going to be listed on the incorporation ballot by law. This is the maximum tax rate that can be levied in 2022 if voters approve incorporation. So it can be lower than that, it cannot be higher. By law, it cannot be higher. So there is no ability for the township board or a new city council or anybody else to all of a sudden raise to a 28.62 tax rate without a vote.
I have one other question.
Wouldn't that take a decade? More than a decade to go to that rate,
It would.
if we
Does it-
raised it every year.
13 years, yes, sir.
Does this board have the authority to establish what the tax rate will be on, where is this?
Next year?
Yeah, it says recommended an increase to 28 at some time in the future. Do we have the authority to set a tax rate other than
No,
what
sir.
we've currently set?
No, Texas property tax laws are very, very clear on how that process works.
I mean, in the end, all this is you take, you do a study, you take a look at the assumptions that you had 3 years ago, you start talking about, the fact that, okay, you need about another $13 million in year 5, essentially, in M&O expenses. And, we should never have we should never have, and this is where we made a mistake. We should never have let them convert that to a property tax number. To start with, number one, in the current model, 36% of our budget is property taxes. So that number needs to be reduced 64% before we even talk about what that number looks like. And so, what they were just doing is showing, that you would have to come up with this additional revenue. We also didn't know that the changes in the internet sales taxes, were coming, and we're collecting considerably more internet sales taxes than we're projecting, prior to that.
Right.
But, this idea of going, well, because they put 28.62 cents in there, then there's a nefarious plan afoot.
Right. Right.
I think the other thing that
It's
really,
nefarious, all right.
I would say surprises me, but quite honestly, at this point, I'm not sure anything that is stated should surprise me. But most of the people that put this information out are involved in real estate, and some of them actually serve on the appraisal district board.
Ugh.
Yet they seem to really have no understanding of how property tax works in the state of Texas. That's really confusing to me.
But I'd also say, I think all of them have our phone numbers, if they had questions.
Well, they certainly have them when they want you to support something.
Okay, so here is another chart that is in this same report. And so what this is saying, what they're attempting to show here is that we have a rapidly growing tax base that's generated a windfall of revenue. So again, that's this person's words, not ours. And so what they're attempting to show here in the orange boxes is the narrative is we've had a $2.4 billion increase in the tax base. The tax rate has remained flat, and so we've accumulated $107 million in reserves. And then we've used, the township has used.
No, go back.
Okay, sorry.
An outside developer's analysis of incorporation.
Look, it's Danny Signorelli. I don't care. I'm just going to call it like it is. The guy posts and tags me to all this stuff. Of course, when I became chairman, the world came to an end. So it's fine. We know he's off by at least 20 million in 2016 and what already existed in reserves. But please continue.
Yeah, we're going to go through all that, yes. And so with this is the first page, or one of the first page, and then so this building this narrative, and then it goes into this leading into, so then that has resulted in building a war chest for incorporation with our tax dollars. So again, that's the narrative that's being presented here. And what is being said is that by not incorporating would allow us to reduce our tax and maintain healthy reserves. And what he is showing here is that starting in 2018, if we had lowered the tax rate to 17 cents, then we could have maintained $56 million in reserves. So again, the claim here is that because the Board of Directors was trying to build this war chest, that they didn't lower the property tax rate, and now we've had all this buildup in cash. So now I'm going to go through this step by step. So, has the growth in taxable property values created a windfall in property tax revenue? So I've just sort of recreated the chart that he had. So here's what has happened in terms of the green line is the property tax values, the blue line is the adopted tax rate. What was not included on the chart that was provided in the analysis is the amount showing the no new revenue tax rate. So that tax rate is the rate that produces the same amount of property tax revenue as the previous tax year. So that is what you show, that's what is limiting your growth in property tax revenue. So here it is with the black line is showing the no new revenue rate imposed on the blue line, which is the adopted tax rate. So you can see there that the Board of Directors, in spite of him saying that the tax rate has remained flat, it has decreased, and it has decreased to the no new revenue rate. Now those rate changes are much smaller over the past 5 years than they were in the first part of this chart, but that doesn't have anything to do with the Township Board of Directors or anybody else. That is just how, that tax rate in black is calculated by the tax assessor. It's not calculated by me or anybody on staff. That by law, that comes straight from the tax assessor. So again, this thing about having a windfall in property tax revenue because the tax rate remained flat while the property tax value growth is just not, that's just not an accurate statement.
But it also ignores that, okay, in 2010, we had a population of X.
Right,
We had so many homes we had to serve. That almost doubled.
right.
So we have to provide trash service. We had to add parks. We had to do things in that decade. It wasn't a static expense from 2010 and a windfall of property tax revenues coming in. No, every time we add a new facility, like the 8 apartments we're going to talk about next week that bring in additional trash costs, right? That has to be accounted for. Not only that, we talked about in the last presentation, Montgomery County decides to do a 5% wage increase. They just increased our budget.
Right,
We didn't have anything to do with that.
right,
An external entity increased our costs.
that's correct.
And we have escalated costs in our trash service contracts. So, I mean, we eventually, need to show, hey, look, here's what it costs to serve, the community. It doesn't go down just because the appraisals went up.
Right, right. And to your point, you can also see here that the green line, which is the growth in taxable value, so while we were having that rapid growth in population, that's reflected there. See how much that grows between 2010 and 2017? And then it does flatten out over the last 4 years as we've reached build-out. So again, these don't have anything to do with us. These are numbers coming from somewhere else, and it's just the reality of the development of the community. So the other thing I wanted to show in relation to the earlier part of this year, another reason that the board was able to lower the tax rate and sometimes below the no new revenue rate was because of all the sales tax growth. As we had that growth in the community, we had the sales tax that went along with that. And this board has taken every opportunity, as was mentioned earlier, to use that any type of other revenue sources to offset what is required from property tax revenue, which is why we only use 36% of our funding comes from property tax. And then here's a look at property tax revenues per capita. So again, very, very consistent, actually the same amount in 2013 as it is in 2022. So this clearly shows that we do not have a windfall of property tax revenue that has been used to fund anything, much less incorporation.
And these are non-inflation.
And that is
These are
correct.
non-inflation adjusted numbers. So, when you put the inflation factor in, the line goes down even further.
It does.
On a per capita basis.
Thank you. You mentioned that last time. I just haven't gotten
Oh,
around to
it's all
doing
right.
it, but I will.
It's okay, Monique. I just wanted to remind you. So,
Thank you. Okay, so another statement that was made in the analysis, as the township has accumulated $107 million in reserves for incorporation, and then there's sometimes, I also hear out there, no, it's not 107, it's 50. But regardless of which number you want to use there, the answer is no. We have not accumulated that amount. Also, just, I should have been, well, the chart down below shows that whatever the chart at top from the outside developer, those numbers are incorrect in terms of what we actually have in our reserves. I have tried to figure out where they may have come from. I cannot, so I gave up. But our numbers are shown down at the bottom, and they tie to our audited financial statements. So that's the amount that's in our reserves. And you can see out of the $105 million in reserves that we have currently, $20.8 million is related to incorporation reserve.
I really think that this needs to be amplified. The $14 million change in operating reserve and capital replacement reserve are driven specifically by inflation and costs, to operate the township. So you got to take those two numbers out. So,
Right.
So the $20.8 million, 17.9 of that was actually generated from non-discretionary other reserves that have been floating around the township for a decade.
Right.
So, this idea that, that suddenly we just stole everybody's money.
Right.
I mean, I'm sorry, but, this is so rudimentary. This is so basic math 101.
Right.
It's incredible to me that, that people who are really smart, and believe me, there's a lot of really smart people out there that are absolutely misinterpreting this data.
Yes, sir.
It's absolutely shocking.
Yes, sir. We've seen this before, so I'm going to go through these like really quickly, but you can stop me if you have questions. So out of the $105 million, as we just saw, these are the components of it. Only $21 million is related to incorporation. The operating reserve is basically a required reserve. Without it, you can't borrow money except for at ridiculously high things. This is hugely important to the positive credit rating that we have. And it's also critical to operations. It represents about 3 months of township general fund expenses in the case of some type of emergency.
And it also highlights there is no imminent risk to the ability for our community to get the services that it needs.
Right.
I mean, we are, and when you get through all your reserve categories, ensuring that all the services our community expects, their
Right.
quality of life,
Right.
is being taken care of. It's funded, it's in the bank, it's audited.
Exactly. And so it's, by board policy, it's maintained at 20 to 25% of general fund operating expenses. And believe me when I say, this is the number one question and focus of the credit agencies. So if you don't have an operating reserve, you can't survive. It's extremely important. We also have a capital replacement reserve, which is certainly not required, but it is considered very, very favorably by our credit rating agencies. They always reference that in their reports. What it does is, instead of having to finance all of your assets, so every time that you have IT equipment or park renovations or replacing playground or fire department, we have a readily available source of revenues in order to fund those. We hired an outside organization to develop a 30-year capital plan, and our capital replacement reserve is built on that. And then finally, we have just what we call other or non-discretionary reserves, 15 million. Most of these are tied down by contract or by law in terms of what we have to set aside. So how was the incorporation reserve funded, and how will it be used? The reserve was funded by favorable sales tax revenue and expense variances, and I'm going to talk about exactly what that means here in a second. Property tax revenues were not used to fund this reserve. If voters approve incorporation, the funds will be used for police department and public works capital expenditures. And then we're going to go through an illustration here where I show that reserve funds absolutely cannot be used to reduce the tax rate or to fund ongoing operating expenses, because they are considered a one-time funding source. So what do I mean by favorable budget variances? This is a natural occurrence in any budget, any local government, any budget. So this is not unique to the township. So every year we do our best to come as close as possible based on a set of assumptions and based on best practices and all the things that we have talked about, what our revenue budget and our expense budget is going to be. But because we budget conservatively, invariably we would always hope that we would have more revenue than we actually budgeted, and we would have less expense than we actually budgeted. So we try to keep those as close as possible, but again, under conservative budgeting, you are going to generate favorable budget variances. What this board and previous boards have used those variances for are to retire debt, to fund budget initiatives and capital projects, and to fund reserves. And yes, some favorable variances were used to fund the incorporation reserves after all of these other items were taken care of. So let's look at the incorporation reserve. This is how it was funded. You can see that most of it came in 2018. There was a $12.6 million transfer out of a contingency fund. So it was an undesignated contingency fund that had been built up since 2012 with favorable sales tax variances and favorable expense variances. Again, not property tax revenue, favorable sales tax, favorable expense. The 2018 is when this current study started. So again, that funding was available and that money was put in there, and there's been no additional funding added to the incorporation reserve since 2018. So this idea that that the board has been overtaxing and pre-funding an incorporation reserve leading up to this year in order for the incorporation election is just not accurate. So I want to show you what happened in 2018, which caused us to have all of that additional money to be able to fund into a reserve. First of all, the township board in 2017 inherited, if you will, and accumulated funds that had been generated by favorable variances from 14 to 16. So in 2014 and 15 and 16, to go back to the first slide, Chairman Bunch was not chairman, I believe. I believe the
No, it
chairman.
would have been Bruce Tuff and Ed Robb.
That is correct. Yes. In 14 and 15, it was Bruce Tuff, and 16, Ed Robb. So coming into this, there was $9 million available that had just been accumulated in funds. What the red line is showing there is in the 18 budget, we had been projecting for 18. So when we're developing the 18 budget, you got to remember the timing here. We're in 2017, right? We're doing that. We had projected that we would have $7.9 million in ending balance in the undesignated. What we ended up with is shown up there at the top. We ended up with $14.6 million. And the reason for that, and this is just a very simple chart, it's way more complicated than this, but this gets to the gist of it. You can see there in 2017 and in 2018, we had big favorable variances in sales tax revenues. So it was just what was going on at the time, and ironically, it's probably because I used too conservative of a sales tax projection, and that's what happens when you do. And then in operating expenses in 2017 also, there was a much larger favorable variance that year than is normally. So when you, sorry, go ahead.
I know you said this is a very simple chart, but I would kind of say that I'm not sure we could make it simple enough for some of the municipal financial modeling experts that are out there creating their own municipal financial models, but I appreciate the attempt you made.
Thank you. So again, this was unique to these years. It was one of the reasons, along with the $9 million that was already available coming into that year, and then the big favorable variances that were going on these 2 years, it did generate a lot of undesignated revenue. So I want to address also that the board of directors did not just take all of that money that was available and put it all into the incorporation reserve. So this is the things during that time period that the board did first. These were the first priorities of the board before any money was ever allocated into the incorporation reserve. The board of directors paid off debt. They started accumulating those funds in 2018, as you can see, and then more in 2019 in order to pay off debt in 2019 when it became callable. And on this particular debt instrument, it saved the taxpayers $1.7 million in interest expense by the board taking that action. So that was one thing that was done with the favorable variances that were available during this time period. This is what the result was again. So you can see during that time period that the debt decreased, the debt balance decreased. The board of directors set the tax rate below the no new revenue rate. So they took that money that was available looking at everything. The board did not keep the tax rate same. They weren't trying to generate additional monies to fund the incorporation reserve. If that was truly the goal, then the board would not have set the rate below the no new revenue rate. So you paid off debt, you dropped the rate below the no new revenue rate. And then these are just some of the what the board of directors funded some major budget initiatives during that time. So additional law enforcement staffing out in Harris County. This was the Creekside YMCA, so eventually known as the Recreation Center at Rob Fleming, Texas Tree Ventures. There was flooding, drainage improvements, some contributions or partnerships with others to provide funding. The small cul-de-sac maintenance program was starting during this time. Projects related to the Bear Branch Master Plan, phases 2 and 4, money set aside for Spring Creek Greenway trails, multiple town green park improvements, cultural arts feasibility study. I could have gone on for pages, but what I'm just trying to show here is that during that time period when that contribution was made to the incorporation reserve, this is everything else that was going on. This were the first priorities of the board, and then after taking all of that, after accounting for all of that, then the board allocated the remaining contingency undesignated reserve to the incorporation reserve. I'm showing this because in the following year, the board they been building a war chest for incorporation, had another opportunity to do so, because this is another year where we ended up with $6 million more than what we had originally projected in our contingency account, but the board did not do that. As I mentioned earlier, 2018 was the only year, and there has been no funding added to the incorporation reserve since then. So all of this additional money was used to fund other reserves and capital projects and budget initiatives. So I had talked about this before, and the main thing that I want to talk about here as we move into the next section is that GFOA best practices and credit agencies require that you fund ongoing expenses, so your operating expenses, with ongoing revenues. That is what is called a structurally balanced budget. It is what the Township Board has always insisted on, and it has always been what has been adopted. And an imbalance, over there in the yellow, it says an imbalance in the budget, e.g. if reserves are being used to fund ongoing operating expenditures, indicates a problem. So that is something that credit agencies would always look for. So first I want to look at this. The outside developer talked about one of the benefits of non-incorporating would be to release the $20.8 million in reserves and turn that into a 9.9 cent property tax decrease. So this is what would happen if you did that. In year one, if you lowered the property tax rate and you used the incorporation reserve to fund expenses of $21 million, then you are not using ongoing revenues to fund ongoing expenses. The GFOA best practice and board policy have been violated, and the violation would have to be reported to the credit agency. So in the second year, the incorporation reserve is depleted and a funding shortfall exists because you still have your $120,000 or $121 million worth of expenses, and right, we don't want to decrease services. Nobody wants that. So you have a $21 million funding gap, and your tax rate's been lowered to 9.9 cents. And with property tax laws, you can't increase it by but about 0.7 cents a year, less than a penny a year, in order to have that funding. So this is why I put this there. We don't do this. The board has never done this. Staff would never present a budget like this, and this is exactly why you do not use reserves to lower the property tax rate. So here I'm going to go back to this slide where the analysis was saying that if the board reduced the tax rate to 17 cents beginning in 2018, they could have carried that out throughout this current five-year plan at 2026 five-year plan and maintained $56 million in reserves. So I ran that through our budget model. So me and John Bruce, actually, I'm going to give John Bruce credit. So we ran that through the budget model to see exactly what would happen if we did that. And again, I don't know what type of budget model or how this came about. I couldn't figure it out, but we just ran it through ours, to be clear. So if you do that, what you end up with is about a $11 million decrease in revenue by lowering the tax rate to that. And this is what you end up having. I'm assuming now we don't want to cut expenses, right? I'm assuming we want to maintain service levels. So without doing this, this is where you end up. First, I'm just going to look for 2018 through 2022. So your incorporation reserve is gone. So that's that. And your capital reserve is down to $3.5 million. So that would have a negative impact on your credit rating. It would require financing of capital assets, and the debt service component of your tax rate would have to increase if you wanted to replace assets timely.
Yeah, I saw this chart a couple weeks ago, and I was wondering, what would the tax rate increase be required in that next year because they decided to bleed out all of the reserves? I know you're saying you could issue debt, but they could also increase the property tax.
Right, you could.
What would that, from their 17 cents, what would they need to have now as they've brilliantly cut the taxes for 5 years using reserves? Now in year 6, time to pay the piper. What's the tax rate required?
We can calculate that and get that for you.
Then that has to go to the voters.
Right.
Because it's going to be more than, the 3.5 cent cap.
A lot more, yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Right.
Yes. Or you'd have to, yes, and then you'd have to start financing all your capital, which then increases the debt service rate. So then so this is where we end up in 2022, and then we extended it out into the 5-year plan, and we used the same assumptions, the growth sales tax, the higher sales tax growth assumptions that we're using in the current model. So we didn't dumb down anything. Everything's exactly just how it was, but just using this 17-cent rate. And this is where you end up at in 2026. So your incorporation reserve is gone, your capital replacement reserve is gone, your operating reserve is gone, and now you're dipping into non-discretionary reserves, which you actually can't do, but that just shows here where we would be.
So the advice that they're providing out there is a financially sound way to lower taxes would bankrupt the community.
Yes, sir, it would.
Well, let's hope that they don't get elected to this board.
And
So-
the other thing that isn't even taken into account here is, if we started doing that in 2017, we wouldn't have been able to pay down $25 or $30 million in debt either. So we'd have another $30 million in debt sitting on the balance sheet on top of it.
That's a great point. You're exactly right.
Bruce, you're confusing the narrative.
And then, so again, just showing here, this is the brown bars are what the outside developer said that we could do, that we could maintain a reserve balances of $56 million with a 17-cent property tax over this period of time. When you actually run those numbers through the township's budget model, that is not true. It's what we just said. We're down to less than 20 million, or between about $26 million in reserves, and that is now we're dipping into non-discretionary reserves, which we actually can't do. So this is a summary, this last slide. This is a summary of this chart, again, just to put all of that into perspective. So the outside developer's financial plan, as shown in this report, violates GFOA and GASB standards, violates the board's fiscal policy, negatively impacts credit rating, results in a structurally unbalanced budget, depletes the operating reserve and capital reserve, requires large increases in debts to finance capital, and is absolutely not sustainable, which would result in a decline in services.
I had this conversation on Tuesday with Commissioner Nowak where he was telling us we should do a 20% homestead exemption, which we did analysis on that several years ago, shows an equally unstable
Right.
outcome. And suggested to him that, the easiest way if he wants us to reduce our taxes would be for him to take on more county expenses. We fund in this calendar year budget about 12 million in law enforcement resources to the county.
Yes, sir.
And with the streetscape maintenance, nearly 6 million. So there's certainly, ongoing expenses that the county could relieve if they really want us to lower the township tax. Because we're artificially lowering their budget with the agreements that we have that we're funding. And so, thank you for doing this analysis again. I suspect based on today's advertising and yesterday's advertising, we'll probably be seeing more new creative ways to confuse the public.
Oh, it's already out there.
Oh, wait.
Someone just sent me a screenshot of something that the commissioner posted about how we're really making a plan for asphalt road maintenance and improvements because we can't afford to do concrete in our budget.
No, it was actually just to fix the asphalt he hasn't fixed, and it's less than 3% of our roadway to bring it up to excellent levels.
Yeah, but that's not the way it's presented.
Of course. Why present the facts?
Well, that's true.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Monique. Okay, I don't think we have anything else for this agenda item, and I know that we appreciate your extra effort because you did more than we did a couple weeks ago, so there's some new points in there that were helpful for us and the public.
Great.
We are going to need a motion and a second to approve the report.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
And Director Snyder has left. She was not feeling good.